Hi everyone, so we're carrying on the 1918 to 1939 course and we're starting this one in 1933. So we've left behind the League of Nations now, you might be pleased to know, and we're moving on to looking at the section of the course which is called the Road to War, where we're looking at what happened between the Allies and Hitler in the years preceding, so from when Hitler becomes Chancellor and then Führer of Germany, and how international tension builds, how the interaction between countries is changing in this time, and how this all leads towards World War I. So today we're going to be focusing on events from Hitler becoming Chancellor to 1935. Quite a lot happens in that year, and we're going to have a look at how the Allies respond to that and how Hitler is going against the Treaty of Versailles. Okay, so we're going to have a look at this in a timeline. So we're starting with 1933, when Hitler leaves the League of Nations Disarmament Conference. So remember, one of the main, I know I said we've left it behind, but it is still relevant. One of the main aims of the League of Nations was international disarmament. So they do have an international disarmament conference in 1933. And the League of Nations held a disarmament conference during which Hitler said that he would disarm as long as every other nation would too, which as we've said would make sense. You would not disarm if other countries were going to keep their weapons, because that would mean that you had left yourself vulnerable to attack. So if other nations would not do this, then he wanted to be allowed to have an army equal in size to that of France. Now, remember, this was not possible because this was forbidden by the Treaty of Versailles. And remember, one of the main aims of the League of Nations was to uphold the Treaty of Versailles. So if they're saying to France, we want to have an army as big as yours, these are two main reasons why France is going to say no, apart from the fact that it just doesn't want Germany to have an army, because otherwise it wouldn't be in the Treaty of Versailles. So this gave Hitler an excuse to storm out of the conference, whilst claiming that it was the French and not him who were being unreasonable. Okay, so Hitler makes a big show of this, and if he's refusing not to rearm, apart from the Treaty of Versailles, which is anyone going to uphold it, is there's nothing stopping him. So Germany then leaves the League of Nations, and so was no longer expected to keep its covenant and work to avoid war. So this is Hitler's first sort of intention, him stating his intention to have a war. And I'm going to come back to that, because that's one of the main mistakes that Chamberlain makes, is thinking that he isn't intent on war. Okay, so then in 1934, we have the Dollfuss affair. So Hitler's born in Austria. It takes quite a few people by surprise that. Another fact about him that's quite surprising is he was a vegetarian. But he was born in Austria, he wasn't actually German. And Germany had been ruled by Austria for around 600 years. Many Austrians and Germans felt that the two countries should be one, and were outraged when Anschluss, which means the joining of the two countries, was forbidden in the Treaty of Versailles. So Hitler's foreign policy included uniting all Volksdeutsch, which means German people, and overturning the Treaty of Versailles. So it made sense that he would try to unite with Austria, which he does do successfully later on in the course. So, aware of Hitler's intentions, the Austrian Chancellor Dollfuss banned the Nazi Party in Austria. So in 1934, Hitler responded by telling Austrian Nazis to create havoc in the country, and they murdered Dollfuss. However, Hitler's plot ultimately failed because the Austrian army supported the government at this time, who weren't Nazi, and because Mussolini moved his troops onto the Austrian border, promising to stop Hitler's Anschluss. Now, this is important, okay, because here, Italy is not supporting Hitler. And that all changes, okay? But this is important here. The reason that Hitler, well, one of the reasons that Hitler was unable to achieve Anschluss at this point is because Mussolini was against him doing so. Hitler realized that his army was not yet strong enough in 1934 to engage in war, so he backs down and claims that the Austrian Nazis had acted alone. Okay? So let's have a look. Well, we'll have a look at the rest of the timeline, and then we'll come back and have a look at the sources about each of them. So in 1935, we have rearmament. Now, remember, Treaty of Versailles restricts the German army to 100,000 men, no air force, and only 15,000 in their navy. So they aren't allowed to rearm. That is the most they're allowed according to the Treaty of Versailles. So Hitler has a freedom to rearm rally in 1935, and he shows off weapons and troops that he had secretly been building. And the way that he secretly builds his armies is in car factories. So he creates factories with a front on them to look like they're making cars when actually he's making weapons and tanks in them. He also announced that he was introducing conscription, which means that every single person of age, every single male of age, was to join the army, and it was compulsory to join the army, which obviously would have put him much above the 100,000 limit, and he does that in 1936. So he expands his army to 1 million men, including a Luftwaffe, which is an air force. So he's allowed 100,000, he's now got 1 million, and he's got an air force. Now, you should be thinking at this point, but hang on, that's against the Treaty of Versailles. The League of Nations should have been upholding the Treaty of Versailles, but remember, by 1935, they're really losing their power after the Abyssinian crisis. So this marked the fact that Hitler was sure that he could openly defy the Treaty of Versailles without other countries stopping him, which he did. Nobody stopped him from doing this. So after that, again in 1935, we've got the Saar plebiscite. Now remember, the Saar was taken away from Germany in 1920 by the Treaty of Versailles, and the Saar was an area of Germany that had rich coal fields, so a lot of money and a lot of resources came from the Saar. So it had been given to the League of Nations for 15 years. So it had been given to the League of Nations in 1920. So 1935, legitimately, that period of time was up. So this agreement was due to expire. So a plebiscite, which means a people's vote, was held to decide who should govern the area, France or Germany. So 90% of the population voted to rejoin Germany, and Hitler was able to use this victory as propaganda to show that German-speaking people wanted to unite under the Nazis. He also gained those rich coal fields back, which could be used to power his industry and build weapons ready for the future, which means that he would get his army now is on the way to being strong enough to achieve Anschluss, which he couldn't do in 1934. So again, in 1935, we've got the Anglo-German Naval Agreement. Now, this is starting the policy. Well, for me, this is included in appeasement, because this is England letting the Nazis have pretty much whatever they want. So the Anglo-German Naval Agreement, when Britain is meant to be part of the League of Nations, upholding the Treaty of Versailles, come up again, undermining the League, going around it, doing its own thing in its own interest, and they come up with a naval agreement with Germany. And because some people in Britain have felt that the Treaty of Versailles had been too harsh on Germany, in June 1935, Britain signed an agreement with Germany saying that Hitler could build his navy to 35% of the size of the British one. So they're not saying, you know, go at it, have whatever you want in your navy, have as many battleships as you want, but they are letting them have a considerable amount of them compared to what the Treaty of Versailles said. So when Germany offered to restrict the growth of its navy and respect Britain's naval supremacy, it was too good an offer for Britain to decline. Now, the problem here, and the mistake that Britain makes here, is trusting what Germany's saying. Britain also allows Germany to build 45% of the number of British submarines, and Hitler uses submarines a lot in World War II. Hitler saw this as Britain admitting that the Treaty of Versailles was unfair, and they could therefore ignore it. So again, Hitler, the thing about Hitler and about appeasement and what he's getting away with is if Hitler asks this and makes these promises and Britain says, yeah, you know, that's fine, you go ahead and do it, and he's allowed to do it. If you were Hitler, you'd probably be thinking, well, what else can I get away with that I wasn't allowed to do? And it allows him to start pushing these boundaries. So the military terms of the treaty were officially dead. Now that's really, really important. And significantly, Britain hadn't consulted France and Italy before signing this agreement. So remember, they're all meant to be working together to uphold the Treaty of Versailles, and Britain has now gone off and done something on its own, which understandably is going to annoy France and Italy. So then finally for this one, we've got in 1935, the Stressor Front. So the Stressor Front was an agreement between Britain, France and Italy that stated that they would guarantee the terms of the Locarno Treaty, protect Austrian independence and work together to stop Hitler from breaking any more terms of the Treaty of Versailles. However, Hitler was not concerned by this agreement. And why should he be? Because already they've got the Treaty of Versailles, they've got the League of Nations, they've got the Locarno treaties, none of which had worked. So why would one more agreement between these countries who are just doing what they want for themselves, not really looking at the bigger picture of things? They all want to keep Hitler on side. Why would this bother him? So what this all does, all of these things in 1933 to 1935, is they allow Hitler to test the actual boundaries to gain confidence and really, really importantly, to build up his armed forces. Okay, so arguably this would have been the optimal time to stop Hitler, but countries, as ever, were acting in their own best interests. Okay, so that's a summary of what this period means for the rest of the time and for Hitler building up his army. So let's go back then and have a look at some of these sources. So this one is Lord Lothian, a British politician, speaking in January 1935, and he says, I am convinced that Hitler does not want war. Hitler always wanted war, right? He wanted Lebensraum, living space for the German people, and how was he going to get that if it wasn't by war? What Germans are after is a strong army which will enable them to deal with Russia. Now that's interesting, isn't it? They don't want war, but they want to be able to deal with Russia. What are they going to do with Russia if it's not going to war with them? Then we've got here a German poster published in 1935, just before the plebiscite. So the fact that it's before the plebiscite in the Saar shows that this is, they're confident that they're going to be getting this back. And we'll finish off then by just looking at Dollfuss. So Dollfuss is the Austrian Chancellor, and he becomes that in 1932, the same year as Hitler becomes the Chancellor in Germany. In March 1933, he shuts down the parliament and bans the Austrian Nazi Party in order to become the the fascist dictator of Austria. He modelled his dictatorship on Mussolini in Italy, and the two became close allies. Okay, and this shows you why Mussolini here is on the side of Dollfuss, not Hitler. Okay, and what becomes important later is when we've got the Rome-Berlin axis and we've got Mussolini and Hitler in an alliance with each other. Okay, that's when people do, when things do become a lot more significant, and Mussolini isn't there anymore to be on the side of the Allies against Hitler, because when you've got these two really powerful dictators together, they're going to be really quite hard to stop. Okay, so please join me in the next video when we'll be looking at the remilitarization of the Rhineland. But that's it for this topic. I hope that's been helpful to you, and I hope that overview's kind of summed up why these events in these years are important. So thank you very much for joining, and I will see you in the next video.